Greetings and welcome to the United States Transhumanist Party Virtual Enlightenment Salon. My name is Gennady Stoliarov II, and I am the chairman of the U.S. Transhumanist Party. Here we hold conversations with some of the world's leading thinkers in longevity, science, technology, philosophy, and politics. Like the philosophers of the Age of Enlightenment, we aim to connect every field of human endeavor and arrive at new insights to achieve longer lives, greater rationality, and the progress of our civilization. Greetings, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to our U.S. Transhumanist Party Virtual Enlightenment Salon of Sunday, August 25th, 2024. Today, we are pleased to bring you a fascinating and challenging conversation on the future of our civilization and some factors, perhaps some subtle factors, that might endanger the kind of techno-optimistic trajectory that we transhumanists would like to see achieved. So joining us today is a distinguished panel. We have our Director of Visual Art, Art Ramon Garcia. We have our member and previous Virtual Enlightenment Salon guest, Alan Crowley. You can watch our Virtual Enlightenment Salon with him of last Sunday, August 18th. And our special guest for today is Professor Robin Hanson. He is an associate professor of economics at George Mason University. He received his Ph.D. in 1997 in social sciences from Caltech. And actually, prior to that, he specialized in physics as well. So he is quite a bit of a polymath. He is a specialist in physics, economics, social sciences. He is, I would say, one of the Renaissance men of our times. He joined George Mason's economics faculty in 1999 after completing a 2-year postdoc at U.C. Berkeley. His major fields of interest include health policy, regulation, and formal political theory. He is also interested in all aspects of the future, including uploading nanotech, cosmology, and the foundations of physics, future economic growth rates, limits of computation, and the origin of life. Quite a wide-ranging set of interests, and that is exactly what we like to discuss in our salons. We like to bridge various disciplines, various fields of human endeavor that have become overly siloed in recent decades. And quite notably for us, in 1998, Robin Hanson wrote an essay, The Great Filter, Are We Almost Past It?, where he essentially introduced the concept of the Great Filter as a possible response to Fermi's paradox, the observation that we haven't or might not have encountered a lot of other intelligent life in the universe. So this is one of the subjects that we would like to discuss with him later today. But the foremost reason why I invited him here is because I was fascinated by a presentation he gave at the Global Cryonics Summit in Miami in July of this year, where he discussed the idea of cultural drift and how, in his view, it might leave us with only a relatively short window of time to achieve the kind of technological progress that we would like to see happen to take humankind to the next level. So with that introduction, I would like to give the floor to Professor Robin Hanson for his introductory remarks. And indeed, our audience is interested to understand the concept of cultural drift to a greater extent. Our friend Mike Lazine writes in the chat, what does cultural drift mean? So let's start there.
Hello, everyone. I'm Robin Hanson. Nice to meet you all. I think I'm just going to talk for a bit here. Apparently, I need to restart Chrome after figuring out how to give it permissions if it's going to be able to have access to a different program on my computer. So I will just talk for a bit. That probably work better. We can have more of a discussion. So let's start with some basics. Think of species. Species have to have some things in common, biological species. A species of cat, the different members of the species, they could vary in the color of the fur, maybe the length of the claws, or some features like that. But then there'll have to be some other features that all the members of the species have in common, so that when they mate, they can make another cat. If you try to mate a cat and an octopus, they're too different, and you just won't have a sensible thing. So in evolution, you have two levels of selection then, two levels of evolution going on. You have the evolution within species, the kinds of things that are allowed to vary within a species, like the claws. Those can vary within a species, and so evolution is better and faster for that when species are bigger. Bigger species means that more places a new innovation could show up, and then it could spread to more others, all spreading within the species. So evolution of things within a species goes better when we have fewer, bigger species. But evolution of the things that species share, that all the members of the species have to share, that goes better when there's more smaller species. And in history, we have had different kinds of habitats on the Earth, some of which are big habitats, so they have big species like ocean sections, and other habitats are small and fragmented, and so they tend to have small species. So think of coral reefs, rainforests, or rivers. They fragment the biology into lots of little habitats, so they have lots of little species. And we could ask, looking back in history, the animals that we have now and then the plants, where did they come from? Did they tend to come from the big habitats or the small ones? And it turns out they came more from the small ones. And so that says that evolution of the features that species shares is actually more important than evolution of the features that can vary within species. And the same happens to be true for firms in our economy. So firms in our economy, they have cultures as well. And there are some things you can vary within a firm, like, invent a new way of marketing, and then it could spread to other divisions in the firm for marketing, a new way of doing transportation, et cetera, a new way of doing meetings. So for the things that can vary within a firm, evolution of those is better when you have fewer, bigger firms. And evolution of the things that firms all share in common, like a firm might have a culture of being very high, document everything, say. And that's a sort of norm across the whole firm. And if we're going to find out whether that's a good norm, we need to have lots of firms that try out different norms. And it turns out that industries with more smaller firms have more innovation compared to the industries with a few big firms, suggesting again that the evolution of the features that firm cultures share is more important than evolution of the things that are allowed to vary within cultures. So that's now prelude to thinking about human macrocultures. So firms have cultures, but the things that firm cultures control what you do at work. When you go home from work, firm culture doesn't influence your behavior that much. But we all are born into and live in larger macrocultures that tell us more about important things in life. How much time to spend on work, how important careers are, how to deal with death, marriage, children, community. We are in cultures that tell us about those things, and I'm going to call those macrocultures. And culture in general is humanity's superpower. So this is really important. The reason why humans are better than other animals, and we just, go much faster than them, they basically have tricycles and we have sports cars. And the reason we have sports cars is because we have culture. So long ago, natural selection didn't even have sex. I don't know if you know that. There was a time when sex was invented. And sex allowed much faster evolution than asexual creatures because you could spread innovations through everybody through sex. And then humans invented culture, and that allows even more places that innovations can come from and spread. And that's our superpower. So that's why we've been going gangbusters for a long time. And the essence of culture, again, it has these two levels. There's things that are allowed to vary within cultures, and then the things that can't vary, that you have to have variation of the culture itself. But we've had wonderful evolution of both of those things for hundreds of thousands of years. And especially lately, we've had great evolution of the things that are allowed to vary within culture. That's technology, economic growth. And that's in part because we've had some big changes in macrocultures in the last few centuries. So say 3 centuries ago, the world was full of hundreds of thousands of little peasant cultures. And each little peasant culture had maybe 1,000 or so people, and it was kind of independent from the other ones around it. They didn't trade that much because they were sort of self-sufficient. If some empire came through, they had to pay taxes, but mostly that just didn't affect how they lived their lives. And these hundreds of thousands of cultures were near the edge of survival. They could suffer famines, pandemics, wars, and if they didn't have a good culture, a functional culture, that could just wipe them out, and then they'd just be replaced by neighboring cultures. So it was maybe not a pleasant life, but we had strong cultural evolution up until a few centuries ago. Hundreds of thousands of small cultures, each of which near the edge of survival. We had strong selection effects. So basically, peasant cultures from a few centuries ago were functional. They were adaptive. They might not have given pleasant lives to people. You could complain about that, but they were functional in the sense of promoting the growth of their descendants and surviving in the world. So in the last few centuries, we had a number of huge changes. So we have the Industrial Revolution, we have enormous growth in our productive capacity. And so we've gotten rich. We've been able to grow the economy faster than we can grow people. So wealth per person, income per person is way up. And that means that we are no longer at risk so much of famines and pandemics and wars. Those selection pressures have gone way down. In addition, we've merged hundreds of thousands of peasant cultures into far fewer national cultures and then a world culture. So there's a famous book called Peasants and the Frenchmen describing how it happened in France, but it happened everywhere. National government showed up and crushed local cultures and said, you're no longer, you don't do things different anymore. You do things the French way. And they made everybody have the French language, French customs, French schools, French everything, because they made national cultures. And so that reduced variation from hundreds of thousands down to maybe a few hundred national cultures. And then in the last century, elites, especially around the world, have merged into a world elite culture. And now elites often typically really define themselves more in terms of their membership in this global elite culture than being members of particular nations. And so we have vastly less variety of cultures than we had a few centuries ago. And in addition, we have faster drift. So cultures naturally change a little every generation. They don't stay exactly the same. But up until a few centuries ago, most peasant cultures were pretty adamant about not changing. They were very traditional, and they didn't like to change, and they tried not to change. They did change, but slowly. And then in the last few centuries, we flipped, and we've decided that our greatest heroes are cultural activists, people who on purpose try to change culture and succeed. Those are people we love and we celebrate them. We have, parades and holidays, whatever for them. And so now our culture changes much faster than it used to. And some of that change is forced by technology, but a lot of it isn't. A lot of it's just ways we change culture because we had cultural activists who decided to go one way and another. Some of this cultural change is random. Like the biggest cultural event of last century was World War II. The fact that Hitler took charge of Germany was kind of random. The fact that they lost the war was kind of random, but nevertheless, the end of that war was very formative for world culture. But it was kind of random. And then there's some other trends we could discuss, if you like, that are more consistent trends over the last few centuries that we can understand more in the sense that there's just some ways that human cultures would drift if allowed that used to be cultural selection stopped dead in the tracks. So think of decadence, which is a common description. There's just a plausible sense in which any local culture in history that got rich, the elites would get lazy. They'd get self-indulgent. They'd have parties. They'd have fancy dress. They would just enjoy themselves. And that's a way in which then often neighboring armies came in and stopped that. Cultural selection didn't let that last too long, but often it's kind of a natural tendency. And then in the last few centuries, those selection pressures have gone away and we have some drifts like decadence, some others we could discuss, but we have some predictable drifts. But the key point is these used to be stopped by selection pressures and they're not anymore. And so these changes aren't plausibly adaptive. And some of them may happen to be adaptive, but on the whole, they're probably maladaptive. And so this is the big lesson here. It didn't take long to get to it. Plausibly, humanity broke the steering on our sports car. We were driving this spectacular sports car that, made us zoom ahead of all the other animals. And we've just turned off the selection process here in the last few centuries. And so we're slowly drifting into dysfunction. And that's a big problem. It's really hard to fix. We can discuss potential fixes, but the most plausible sign of this is falling fertility. So fertility has been falling consistently for a while now, worldwide. And from a biological point of view, it's just not plausible that you would be adaptive to fall fertility the way we have in good times. Now, in past for animals, it makes sense in terrible famine or something to cut back on fertility until you can afford to have kids again. But in good times like we have, we still have very low fertility. And plausibly, if you look at the causes of fertility decline, you can list a number of cultural trends that seem to be the proximate causes. So I can just go through here. I could say gender equality, intensive parenting, longer inflexible school paths to our career paths, marriage as capstone rather than a cornerstone, grandparents having less control over parenting of their kids, more urbanity, less religion. These are all trends that plausibly cut fertility. And the idea is these aren't adaptive trends, and they are a sign, the clearest sign I can offer to you, at least in a short space, that we are in fact suffering from this cultural drift process. And this falling fertility is on track to lead to a peak population in a couple decades and then falling world population. And that will plausibly lead to greatly falling innovation rates and plausibly less liberality in terms of societies and governance. We can think of some plausible fixes, but they require enough support to reverse some of these cultural trends that are quite treasured by people. And even then, that wouldn't be fixing the underlying problem of cultural drift. I have some thoughts about how we could fix cultural drift, but maybe this is a good time to pause and discuss what I've said so far. And then if you like, when you're ready, we could talk about fixes.
All right, excellent. Thank you very much for that overview. And I do think that was a great introduction to the concept of cultural drift. I'll ask a question about that first, and then we can talk about declining fertility as perhaps a symptom of the cultural drift that is being experienced right now worldwide. But in terms of innovation and where we see innovation happen more, you pointed out that, for instance, within smaller populations, it's possible to evolve certain traits faster, certain traits that are more different from what has been encountered before. Does that also apply, say, in a human context, if you have a smaller society that's somewhere on the periphery of the main events that are happening, that it might be possible to innovate faster? Let's say there's some small country that's kind of uninvolved in global affairs, but it's fairly prosperous enough that people there can focus on creative activities, on invention. They have a fairly high standard of living. Would you expect from that country to emerge a faster rate of technological progress, more governance innovations, perhaps because people actually have a chance to implement something innovative, as compared to a large, let's say, quasi-imperial country like the United States or Russia or China?
Right. So there's two issues here. One is the kinds of innovation you might expect to see in different places, and the other is how big a difference is enough. So if we think about, say, innovations in cars or in computers or in food, when those innovations are allowed to be different, when they aren't regulated to be the same, then the big, main, rich countries are where you expect to see most innovation, because again, in the large shared culture, you have fastest innovation of the things that are allowed to change within a unit. But if you're looking for innovation of the things that we share in these larger units, then you'd have to look for the smaller deviants. So, for example, you might have thought, like for many kinds of regulations, some small country somewhere would be allowed to deviate. Now, if you look at regulation of medical ethics or nuclear energy or airlines or banking, you'll actually find surprisingly strong convergence around the world. For example, the only country in the world that allows organ sales is Iran. And bioethicists are getting together all the time saying, how are we going to make Iran stop doing this terrible thing? And that's true for a lot of other countries. If you looked at the beginning of COVID, you noticed that basically all of a sudden, the usual epidemiologists said the usual thing, and then elites got around the world and talked about what to do, and they said, no, we're going to do this other thing. And then the entire world did the same thing after these elites got together and decided to do something different. So there really is pretty strong cultural convergence around the world on a lot of things. And so we actually don't, even the smallest countries around the world don't actually deviate that much on, you say, things like polygamy. Or for example, there's very few places that allow that. Very few places allow child labor, right? I mean, there's just, even though we have a huge world of 8 billion people, we have relatively low variation on a lot of key cultural things. Now, the small groups that succeed in being different enough are an important lesson, because you see just how different it takes. So that would be, say, the Amish or the Haredim in Israel. They are very different and very insular. So it highlights insularity is the key. It's less about being small and more about being insular. The insularity is what allows a small culture to actually be different. They have to resist outside influences, outside contact. And the Amish have doubled every 20 years for the last century. Haredim are increasing at a similar rate. And in 2 centuries, that's a factor of 1,000. So right now, the Amish say 400,000. The Haredim are more. And so in a couple centuries, that's enough to take over the world, basically. Now, that might sound fanciful, but that's in fact what the Christians did. The Christians started from like a few hundred people, and then in 3 centuries, they took over the Roman Empire by doubling every 20 years. So apparently it's possible for small groups to just do that. Now, the Mormons are an object lesson into being different, but not different enough. The Mormons, a century or so ago, they were quite different, and they had quite insular, very different cultural practices. And then the Mormon Church made a conscious decision to integrate more with U.S. culture. They, used their central power to enforce that in the Mormon world, and they succeeded. And now Mormons are more, say, fertile in the rest of the U.S., but they're on the same trend, basically 2 decades behind everybody else. So, and you might think the Mormons are pretty different. And so you have to say, but that's not different enough. Now you have a really high standard. So in some sense, one solution to cultural drift would just be have a lot more cultural variety. And that could be in the form of a lot more cults. Cults is the name we give to small descended cultures. And if we just were more indulgent and encouraging of cults, that could help. But we actually hate cults. So that's, I could say more, but basically I've done some surveys. I asked for about 12 different kinds of variety around the world and whether people wanted more or less of it. And the kind people wanted the least variety of is fundamental values. People like the idea that people have different songs and clothes and climate and art and things like that. They hate the idea of people having different values. So that's why people don't like cults and typically suppress them. Anyway.
Yes. And it is interesting because to some extent here in the transhumanist community, we do have some fundamentally different values, not all compared to the mainstream culture. And certainly our divergence is not as great as that of the Amish or the Orthodox Jews. But for instance, in terms of the extent of value we place on technological progress and overcoming the historical limitations of humanity, we have a very different culture from the dominant culture, which our friend Adam Grease has aptly characterized as a culture of existential hedonism. And the most charitable way to characterize it is find something that gives you meaning and fulfillment and enjoyment and essentially rinse and repeat until you die within this kind of broadly humanistic framework that acknowledges that this life is valuable to an extent, but you can't really affect the major parameters of it, like the length of your life or some of the obstacles you find along the way. So you figure out a way to cope with it and enjoy it as much as you can. So that's the dominant culture that I see today. And the transhumanists say, well, this can lead to some suboptimal adaptations, right, let's say, and we embrace, let's say, a more progress-driven and in many cases more meaningful view that allows us to look at a longer-term future that contemplates our own survival within it. Would you agree with that kind of contrast?
So almost everybody likes the idea that they are in some somewhat different subculture. the idea that you are just a generic member of world elite culture isn't very appealing to people. So most everybody is trying to grab onto some marker of something different that they identify with. And say fandom and music and entertainment are a huge source of this. So if you think about, say, people who like Star Trek versus Star Wars, to take one classic conflict, they get a lot of identity and meaning out of picking one of those tribes and being part of it. But if we stand back and we say, well, okay, but how do they live their lives different? Do they pick different jobs? Or do they have different emphasis on jobs? Do they live in different places? Do they have different stances toward parenting or toward relatives or neighbors? They don't. They get this identity out of being Star Trek or Star Wars, but it doesn't actually affect much of the rest of their life. And that's the kind of variety we have in the world mostly. We have relatively limited variety of the key life choice values and norms. And then we focus on some, salient surface changes as our key things. And we're proud of those. We're proud to go to a different kind of restaurant than other people do and listen to different kind of music. And, if you meet somebody at a party, whatever, they're happy to go on about their particular things and how they're different and how they like those. But the question is it enough to really, support the kind of cultural variety and selection that humanity needs to get out of this cultural drift problem? That's, even the Transhumanist Party, I want to say, I'm glad you have some differences, but I want to do you parent different? Do you die different? Do you go to school different? Do you have neighbors different? How do you live your life different? Because that's what actually humanity for hundreds of thousands of years had as variety in how you live your life, such that humanity could learn how to do these things.
Very interesting. I would say many of us are cryonicists, so that is a different approach toward death. Also, many of us, of course, actively support life extension research in hopes that we don't have to resort to the cryonics option. So that is a difference. In terms of the other cultural factors, they are very diverse among transhumanists. So I can't really make a singular characterization. I can say about 85% of us are male, which is interesting in and of itself. And most of us are between the ages of 40 and 70, which is also interesting to explore. I think this has more to do with the general environment of greater techno-optimism in which the 40 to 70 demographic grew up compared to younger people and people over 70. Some of them are interested in transhumanism. Many of them, though, probably don't see as much hope for themselves. And those who are into transhumanism might see cryonics as plan A rather than plan B. So those would be my characterizations. I'm curious, though, about the worldwide decline in fertility because it is common across countries. And while, of course, the rates of reproduction are still higher in places like Africa and the Middle East, we know that, for instance, the average number of children per woman has declined considerably in those countries as well. So maybe from 7 to 8 to 3 to 4 in even the countries where the population is growing the fastest. And I'm trying to understand the common denominator behind that decline. Some of your earlier comments suggested that there may be a kind of global monoculture. And it seems, at least from a surface point of view, that it's influenced to a great extent by American cultural production. So a lot of people, for instance, will watch Hollywood movies, or they'll purchase American-made brands, American technologies. They'll look up to American celebrities. But is that the entirety of it? Or is there some sort of, let's say, global cosmopolitan elite culture on top of it that's capable of influencing decisions the way you described, for instance, during the early pandemic when the lockdowns, which I think in retrospect were quite a poor idea, even though I am very concerned about COVID, as you know, and properly managing COVID. But these lockdowns were implemented almost universally throughout the world, with the exception of Sweden, in some cases Japan, and more authoritarian countries, paradoxically. So what is happening here? Is there an influence of a kind of global monoculture that is able to produce these declining fertility trends worldwide?
I mean, yes, there basically is a lot of shared world culture that people don't notice so much. People like to focus on how they are different, and each place is different to some degree, and each group is different to some degree, but they're not noticing just how much we share. So I think if you read history, go back a few centuries or even a few thousand years and read what people were like back then and what their values and norms were, you will start to see just how different the modern world is and just how little we vary among ourselves compared to that degree of variation in the past. We just share an awful lot of values worldwide at the moment, and norms. And so, for example, when I meet elites around the world, they tell me the following two things. First, they will tell me that the place they are from has special characteristics that makes a distinction, and these characteristics are valuable and the world should value them. You go to Brazil or Nigeria or Indonesia or wherever you go, they will tell you that the people where they come from are different and that those differences are good. They're valuable. The world should appreciate and value those differences. And then they'll also tell you that they personally will fit in just fine in any global organization, and you won't notice any difference about them. They aren't tainted by whatever differences are distinctive of the place they come from. They are completely interchangeable global elites. And they are, in fact. You hardly see anything distinctive about them. They trained at major universities. They've been in global organizations. They've been hanging out with other global elites, and they are part of a global elite culture.
Interesting. And, I have at various times called myself a cosmopolitan, a citizen of the universe, in the sense that I don't think the place of my origin is necessarily definitive of my identity, though I most likely have influences from it. I've learned certain lessons about life from having been, as I like to say, the scion of two declining empires. But on the other hand, I would like to see a mode of cultural interaction where people can find meaningful common ground and a basis for collaboration and a basis for advancing our joint human interests without conflict in a kind of, let's say, cosmopolitan culture. But I don't like crackdowns on variety either. I don't like the idea that some particular norm, especially if it's a coercive norm, has to be imposed upon everybody. So that's one reason why the lockdowns troubled me. I do wonder, is it possible to have a kind of global Star Trek Federation type of culture or something similarly benign? It doesn't have to have those exact same values, but without the decline in beneficial cultural variety that advances innovation.
So we could start to talk about fixes, but I feel like at this point I should ask, are there questions in a chat list of text questions, or the other people I see on the screen here? Do they have other things to talk about before we start going into fixes?
We've got a question from Alan, and he could elaborate on it as well. He's wondering, is cultural drift a good or bad axis, or is it more like surfing a wave and staying on to ride the goal? And I may be kind of interpreting the question, but is there like a normative value attached to any particular amount of cultural drift? And Alan, please feel free to elaborate.
Yeah, gladly. Yeah, I'm finding your thoughts fascinating, and I'm curious. I mean, drift can be left or right or up or down, etc. But I mean, is it necessarily like good and bad drift? I mean, our own national political process. Some would like our culture to drift one way, some drift the other. Both think their way is good, right? I mean, and have condemned the other. So I'm curious, is it necessarily a good or bad thing, or is it a matter of sort of an epigenic type relationship with the environment of the world at the time, right? This is how our culture interacts with the world, and so that macro culture can survive. I don't know. What are your thoughts on that?
So most people, when they talk about good or bad, they inherit those concepts from their culture, and then they often pick a side in cultural fights to try to make one side win the fight over another. So almost all discussion of norms and morals and good or bad is typically done in the context of a particular culture where the speakers are mostly embracing most of the norms of their culture, and then picking a side in a current cultural fight as the better direction culture should go, mostly referring to basically the cultural norm, saying this is more a natural extension of who we've always been, that we should go this way. So and that whole conversation is enormously high status. That is, in some sense, the highest status people as intellectuals in our society are the people who do these cultural fights, especially the ones who win. Interestingly, cultural warriors of this sort are our highest status people, but the people who actually study the nature of cultural evolution and the process itself are pretty low status. And there is a literature of how culture works, but nobody cares about that because they all want to join the fight and see this abstract analysis doesn't take sides about who's good or bad. It's just describing natural selection. So the key concept for the abstract cultural evolution thing is adaptation, maladaptation fitness, basically. It's, can a culture maintain itself, grow itself, have descendants? That's the measure of adaptation from a biological point of view.
Right.
That's the metric that cultural evolution use. But the people in a culture, and you bring that up and they all go, oh no, surely we shouldn't be willing to just survive at any cost. Surely we have principles and we must be willing to fight for our principles, even if it means we go away and die. And people are very eager to assert the primacy of their cultural values over adaptation, over survival, and maybe tolerate and accept the possibility of extinction if that were the cost. So, for example, in recent discussions about fertility, I see many people say to me and to other people, basically, look, okay, I could see maybe fertility is kind of a problem, but look, before we discuss I need you to agree right up front that these cultural values are off the table. We're not going to change any of these. Because I fear that you're going to try to mess with, gender equality or whatever it is. And there's no way I'm going to discuss any solution to this problem that possibly messes with those things, because those are sacred. And so you can see the energy here of, I'm struggling to get people to see this cultural problem. And one of the key obstacles I get is they start to suspect that I might not be loyal to my culture. I might be willing to abandon key elements of our culture if that's what it took to not go extinct. And they don't like that. They say, no, you should be dedicated to our culture. If extinction is the price of being who we are, then that's what we want.
It's interesting because John H. in our chat points out that the cultural innovators are not always loved. It depends on how they want to change cultures.
Well, when they win, they're loved.
Right.
When they lose, they're hated. The people Hitler is hated, right? Hitler was the losing end of the World War II cultural fight, and he's the absolute worst villain, right? So yes, cultural warriors are hated or loved depending on whether they win or lose.
Yes, indeed. And there is, as John H. also points out in the chat, a kind of explicit antinatalist influence within the culture. And this is essentially an intentional philosophical position. It's espoused by people like David Benatar, for instance, and I don't know what the distribution is of explicit antinatalists versus people who bring up more, let's say, pragmatic considerations, say the cost of living is too high, or they want to pursue other opportunities, or as Daniel Tweed pointed out in our chat, perhaps the state of the world is not suitably stable or suitably benign for them to feel like they would want to bring children into the world. So I don't know what the distribution of motives is, but there do seem to be very clear cultural influences that are more explicit than implicit. What do you think about that observation?
I think most people think, okay, yeah, fertility decline, that looks like it could be a problem. Maybe we should do something about that. But then when they see that treasured cultural trends are the source of the fertility decline, they get much more worried about doing something about it, because they really are quite reluctant to reverse or, these treasured cultural trends that are the cause of fertility decline. And they were, like I said, they're willing to discuss it as long as we can put those off the table and find some other way to do this that doesn't affect the culture they love. And that's going to be a problem. So, for example, there's a straightforward financial fix that would work. We could, for example, let parents endow their kids with debt or equity such that they owed the parents a lot of money when they were older, and then let the parents sell that in order to pay for parenting. And if we did that, yeah, there'd be a lot more parents, but people hate that idea. That's just terrible. That's a terrible thing to do to kids. But every kid in the US is endowed with their fraction of the national debt automatically. That's $100,000 of nominal debt, but roughly $400,000 to $700,000 of unfunded liabilities. And that means every kid in the US is worth that much to the rest of us, if in fact we're going to tax them more later to pay for those unfunded liabilities. That means we should be willing to pay parents a cut of that to have kids who will then come up later and pay back that debt. And there's a way to do it that encourages higher quality kids who will pay back more debt. You give basically parents a share of their kids' future tax payments that they can sell to other people. But and that's a win-win deal. Basically, we give parents this money that comes from the future that they can sell, that is only there because the kids exist. And so we're not taking it from anybody else. But I think the problem with that is, if we institute it, would in fact, some people would figure out how to get that money. They would figure out how to change their lifestyles to get that money. And those changes would reverse some of the key cultural trends. There'd be less gender equality of those people, or less schooling, or less intensive parenting, or something. We don't know what, but somehow they would, and then people would think that's terrible. And that would be the problem. I would still love for us to try, but that's roughly what we're up against.
It's interesting, though, and I wonder what your thoughts are on this. Could there be a kind of, let's say, natural dynamic of increased prosperity that could solve this to some extent? And the reason why I posit this is because where we are seeing, let's say, greater fertility throughout the population is, on the one hand, among people who are the least economically well off, in part because a lot of their reproduction is unplanned still. But on the other extreme, we have people like Elon Musk who have 12 children because they can, and they want to make a statement in doing that. The people who seem to have the lowest fertility rates are essentially the people in the middle, and that's my demographic, the middle class. So why are they having fewer kids? I think it's because of various both socioeconomic and cultural pressures, where they're not quite able to say, given rising costs of living, given various other economic pressures and the increasing precarity of our society, that they would be able to provide their children with stable upbringing through a philosophy of intensive parenting, more intensive parenting, certainly. But what if they become more prosperous? What if we actually have a society that elevates the current middle class into a new, much larger upper class? Would we solve the fertility problem there?
That seems pretty unlikely to me. Basically, when you get to the richest people, the data is less. And so the estimates just get noisier. And every once in a while, somebody fits the data and they get a trend going up, and other times they fit it and then going down. But when they get the trend going up, they have news articles saying, oh, the rich people have more kids. Elon Musk is not representative of the rich. I'm afraid there just isn't this trend of rich people having more kids. That's just not a thing. So that's not a solution. It would be nice if it were. We could, get rich and then we'd have higher fertility. But, the single most consistent predictor of lower fertility through the last few centuries is wealth. So there are other predictors that maybe do better in details, but people getting rich has been sort of basically the key cause at a general level of lower fertility. But again, fertility is just a sign of the deeper problem. So once I realized that, I switched my attention from fertility to cultural drift about 6 months ago. And so that's what I've been focused on this. And it's much harder to come up with fixes for cultural drift than it is for fertility decline, unfortunately.
So what are some other aspects of this cultural drift that lead you to believe that there's a limited time window for continuing technological progress to the extent that we would find desirable and able to bring about the transformation we want? And what are some of the forces that, let's say, are working against the continuation of that level of progress?
So compared to previous centuries, our modern world is doing gangbusters at innovation, right? And that's because we have some new cultural elements that promote innovation, and those are good and adaptive. And because we have this huge integrated world culture, so we can get scale economies and division of labor across a huge globe, unprecedented size. So that's all good for innovation. Unfortunately, we just have very basic economic theory that makes sense to me as an economist, that says that if population starts declining, innovation rates will decline as a result of that directly. It's not because of other cultural elements that would be going wrong. So we already have some, headwinds in terms of regulation and things, as you may know. For example, we've not realized most of the potential of nuclear energy because we overregulated it, and we've overregulated many kinds of promising medical technologies and other things, but still we've got much faster innovation than people centuries ago had. So we're still doing great. But the problem is our simple standard model of innovation is that innovation rate is roughly proportional to the size of the economy at the time. And in an exponentially growing economy, the number of new innovations introduced per year is a substantial fraction of all the innovations we've ever had before, because the economic rate in this last year is a substantial fraction of the entire economic activity ever so far. That's what an exponential is like. But if it's an exponentially declining economy, then the last recent years' innovation is not a substantial fraction of the integral of all the activity so far. And so it will seem, even if we have the same style of innovation activity, even if we did innovation exactly the same way, we would see innovation grinding to a halt because of this integral effect. And when innovation is just much less potent and noticeable because of that, there'll be less of a cultural priority to promoting it. And so plausibly, innovation is the main reason the world has been more liberal. That is, the Industrial Revolution happened in England and then Netherlands, and they happened to be relatively liberal cultures, and they got really rich, and the rest of the world said, we're in trouble. They're running ahead, and we need to catch up. And so to catch up, they tried to copy whatever they could about these winning nations, including their liberality, and that's why the world is much more liberal than it used to be. But if innovation stops, then there's not much point in making cultural sacrifices to promote innovation like liberality. Most authorities don't want to be liberal. They've just been forced to be liberal because that's what it seemed like it took to get rich. So the world will just be less liberal and less innovative. And then a few centuries later, we'd be replaced by the Amish and Haredim, who are also not particularly pro-innovation, not particularly liberal. And it might take a while before innovation came back again.
So this is interesting because essentially the trajectory of cultural decline would essentially be manifested as economic decline leading to less liberality, leading to the illiberal cultures taking hold. I do wonder, though, whether the scaling up of the illiberal cultures is sustainable. So yes, the Amish have a high reproduction rate, but the Amish also actually have a mechanism for letting their young experience the rest of the world when they're around 18. It's called Rumspringa, and they're able to go out and they're able to then make a decision to stick with the Amish community or to go out into the wider world. I do think a lot of them choose to stick with the Amish community because they have
93% stick, so it's only 7% loss rate.
Right, but I wonder if as that Amish community multiplies, let's say it scales up by an order of magnitude because it has a higher reproduction rate, are they really going to be able to maintain that kind of insularity? Or will there be a critical mass of Amish kids, young people who start
Right.
questioning the norms of the culture and saying, well, maybe this technology is actually good. Maybe we should embrace it. And some might
Right.
say, let's work it into the Amish culture. Others might say, no, we want this broader, more technological culture because it helps us achieve our goals to a much greater extent.
There's clearly a risk. We can't just be blasé. So the example of the Mormons shows that there are many risks. Now, the Amish and Haredim are admirably fragmented and decentralized, so they are not much at risk of the Mormon failure of a central church imposing a new policy of integration on everyone. They basically, each group of 100 or so people is just a completely separate group that can decide everything on their own, and so they do. So that means they have a lot of internal variety to overcome, bad choices of some of them, and that's powerful for them. So the Christians did succeed. So clearly it is possible to just keep doubling every 20 years for several centuries. That's at least a possibility. Now, there's two effects to think about here. The first I would think is the surface area to volume effect. That is, when they're really small, a substantial fraction of their interactions are going to be with people outside their group. And that's going to be a risk. As they get bigger, a larger fraction of the interactions can be with people inside the group, if at least they maintain the same sort of styles of interaction. Now, going against that, though, is the fact that, the way to stay the maximum insular was to be, farmers, to be rural, and just to have a form of production that meant you didn't have to interact with people very much. And they kind of grow so far that they felt they were maxing out on farming. And they needed to switch. And so in the last generation, they have in fact switched to rural small business. They are a minority farmers now. They are mostly not farmers. And that does mean that, their kids can't be helping on the farm during the weekends and work days so much because it's harder for the kids to help at a small business. So they are undergoing some transformation, and that's risky, but, honestly, they're doing an impressive job of having made this transition. And you have to realize how big an ask this is. If they double every 20 years and say they're farmers, they have to not only feed themselves, they have to save enough money to buy enough farmland and buildings to double all of those every 20 years. So they've been really remarkably productive at not only about doubling their population, but doubling all the infrastructure, all the supporting capital that it takes to support their lifestyle. And they've done that successfully for a century. And now they've moved to rural small business. So an example, the Haredim and the Amish both are pacifist. You might think, well, why be pacifist? And it makes sense if you're trying to be max insular, because a big risk of losing people in your culture is young men going off to war. Young men bond very strongly in war. And so you don't want your young men going off and bonding with other soldiers in war. And so that's a reason to be pacifist. Once they're big enough to field their own military divisions, that won't be a problem. So there are many things that go better as they get bigger. Surface area to volume ratio is a win, but they will have to move into more sectors of the economy that naturally just have more interactions with other people. That's the key trade-off.
Yes, and I am seeing this as well in terms of any documentaries that I've seen, any information that I've gotten about how the Amish interact with the rest of the culture. They're not hostile at all.
No, not at all.
They take advantage of economic opportunities. Indeed, some of the ways of living that they have are only sustainable because they have a positive symbiotic relationship with the mainstream culture. Indeed, they're not opposed to using advanced healthcare either. So they live longer because of reliance on modern medical technology.
Right, but they don't want their members to go become doctors, because then they have to go to medical school and mix with everybody else as young, impressionable people, and they have a much higher rate of losing them that way. So they tend to focus on technologies that they can learn within their culture. They don't want to send people off somewhere else to learn. Then they mix with other people. So, their main ways they're anti-technology or anti-technologies that mix them with people. They're anti-cars because you can go visit people if you have cars. They're anti-phones, internet, because that connects you to people. But they're not anti-farm machinery. They're not anti-business machinery. They're happy to use those technologies as long as they can learn them in their community without mixing with other people.
They have thought this through. Now, there's an interesting comment by our friend and foreign ambassador in Togo, Siba Chamuza. He writes, cultural values are changeable. The essential thing is that the individual and collective cognitive capacity to optimize this dynamism in favor of well-being, not to make it a source of disastrous conflict. So I think he's focusing on what the outcome of culture and cultural drift would be. And in that regard, the pacifism of the Amish and the Orthodox Jews could actually be helpful to us for achieving our vision, because they won't fight us. They might have different values. Our friend Daniel
Right.
Tweed in the chat also even pointed out there might be a possibility for some Amish transhumanists emerging in the future if we're sufficiently, let's say, peaceful and collaborative with them. Maybe they will think, well, this radical life extension is not such a bad idea either.
So the Christians were also pacifist, but once they became dominant, they switched. So I wouldn't count on them staying pacifist, but that seems just a current strategy. I suggest maybe we should move to talking more about fixes here.
Sure.
We've talked about the problem and how it realizes itself and its nature of the problem. And there's basically, I see three classes of solutions. One class of solution is the most optimistic, whereas it just fixes itself. We don't do anything. So in some sense, like the Amish and Freedom taking over is a fix. Now there's a risk that they would also then have monoculture and then also face drift and have another crash and have several cycles of rise and fall of civilization. That's a thing that's happened in the past in human history, so it's not a crazy thing to happen in the future. Another variation, though, on a automatic fix is if we achieved human level AI or brain emulations in the next roughly 70 years of progress before innovation stops. Because AIs and brain emulations are naturally, if we allow them, Malthusian. That is, it's possible to grow them faster than their economy grows, even if their economy can grow much faster. So the wealth or income per individual falls until it reaches subsistence level. And so then they would be much like the peasants of our distant past, being on the edge of survival. And that plausibly would give stronger selection pressures, plausibly enough to overcome cultural drift, if we allow them to have different cultures. So as you may know, there are a great many people around today concerned about what they call AI risk. And their key concern is that AIs might be independent of us, to have their own opinions and make their own choices about themselves. And they would like to somehow lock that down and prevent it. They're concerned that AIs that have their own powers and autonomies would then make choices we might not approve. And some of those choices might be to kill us all for some reason. And therefore, to prevent this, the AI kills us all scenario, they want to make sure that lock down the AIs or even Ms and make sure that they can't have their own different culture and make their own different choices. In which case, it would not fix cultural drift. We would lock them into following us into the grave on our cultural drifting path. But AIs that are less in control of us, by us, they would then be subject to cultural selection. And then we'd have the revival of a healthy sort of cultural selection with AIs or M. So I'm the author of this book, The Age of M, Work, Love, and Life, When Robots Rule the Earth, about brain emulations. And looks like he was ready with the tag there. So I said there's three classes of solutions. Number one is it fixes itself. And that's kind of a fix itself. And so honestly, I might hope for that. If we just develop human level AI or Ms before this deadline, which is, many decades away, could happen, then it doesn't matter how many people there are. Human fertility can decline because these other fertilities would rise. But I still think that's a bit of a long shot, but still, let's hope and work for it. And then that leaves two other classes of solutions. The second class of solutions sounds good, but seems kind of wishful. But the idea is that we, as members of our culture, decide to push culture in a more adaptive direction, and then we win. And then culture is more adaptive. And then I guess somehow we have to keep it there and prevent it from drifting off again, somehow by the force of our influence over culture. And that all only requires that we compete among the most prestigious people in our world who have the most deep passions trying to push cultures in their directions. And we have more prestige and more passion than them, and we induce the whole game to go our way, culture-wise. You can see that's a big ask. And not only do we have to move it our way, we have to move it somewhere, and then we have to hold it there, like through our conscious thoughts about saying, no, this is where culture should be. So somehow we need to make culture sort of aware of itself, and to reason about itself, and then to choose to go in a good place by the force of culture. Now, this is just not how humans have ever done it before. Cultural evolution has almost never been consciously chosen from the point of view of trying to be adaptive. It's been consciously chosen from the point of view of trying to win culture wars, to impose your set of values over other people's. But the idea that you would choose cultural values from their point of view of being adaptive, that's pretty alien to human nature. And in fact, people kind of hate the idea. There's this thing called social Darwinism, and that's the name people gave to the hated idea that we should reason about evolution and figure out how we should behave socially as a result of that. And people hate that, and it's got a terrible name. Now, maybe they were thinking about DNA evolution, but cultural evolution is the same sort of natural selection. It just happens differently and faster. And you can do the same thing. You can be a social Darwinist, literally, by reasoning about what cultures would be adaptive and trying to make our cultures be adaptive. But people hate social Darwinism. But I could list specifically some of the directions cultures could go to be adaptive. So like one would be multiculturalism, a deeper multiculturalism than we have, that we discussed before. Basically, so DNA has special features to promote speciation. I don't know if you know. That is, the mating systems of animals and plants have higher mutation rates because that makes it easier to form a new species. And so culture might plausibly also want to have a special features to promote new cultures, i.e. cults, i.e. maybe it's good. Maybe it would be good if it would be adaptive to have more indulgent attitudes toward cults. But they'd have to be really actually different. They're not just surface difference, and have an indulgence. We're a long way from that, but that would be a more healthy culture. Another thing we could do is just sort of maybe have very explicitly selfish evolutionary values, like people suspect of the social Darwinists, basically just saying, well, no, this is what it takes to survive, and we're just going to value this, and to hell with everybody else. People hate that idea, but maybe it could still win. It sounds not very pro-social. It sounds selfish and self-oriented and defying our brotherhood of mankind and that sort of thing. But if we chose it, that could be more adaptive. Another thing that could work if we just let capitalism go wild. So, for example, with fertility, if we just allowed capitalists to make, orphanage baby factories and, raise kids and sell them when they were older, that would solve fertility, and that would probably solve a lot of cultural drift problems. Most of the cultural drift problems we have are areas where capitalism is sort of not allowed to mess with. We have values and we say, nope, for profits aren't supposed to mess with this over here. And then we've got drift with those. But people at the moment are not at all inclined to let capitalism go wild with everything. So that's, again, not very promising. Another approach would be the return school. So many people over the years had a conservative attitude, by which they meant we're changing too fast. We should not change so much because we're not so sure where we're going. And I think we got to admit they were right. Those complainers were in fact right. We were changing things too fast, and we are going places we didn't understand. Unfortunately, going back is pretty hard. We're going to go back to some, say, year 1800 set of cultural values, because unfortunately, a lot of the cultural values were mixed up with technology. And so what we'd really have to do is go back to some previous set of values and then abstract from that, the way it was embedded in technology, and find some technology robust version of it, and then embrace that for our culture, and then not change it again, not let it change the way it did the first time. And again, that's a big ask. But you see, the fundamental problem is if culture is our main mechanism for making choices and deciding who we are and what we value, how are we supposed to change it exactly?
Mm-hmm. Yes.
What other lever do we have over this thing? This has been the thing in charge of us all along.
Well, out of the solutions that you articulated, and I know that you're just exploring the spectrum of possibility, so I don't think you necessarily endorse every one of the solutions, but the best one for our standpoint would be rights for AIs or Ms. We do have the Transhumanist Bill of Rights version 3.0, where we try to outline a framework for just that. And to the extent that sentient AIs, truly self-aware, multi-purpose artificial general intelligences are developed, yes, we do think they should have rights. And the question is, how soon will they emerge? And will the culture, again, permit them to have the kinds of rights to engage in essentially autonomous cultural innovation?
Right.
Or will they be suppressed to some extent, or will people fail to recognize the point at which they actually become sentient and perhaps cause conflict by, let's say, unduly restricting them or seeing them as tools past the point where they are actually only tools, only narrow AIs?
And worse, they could just slow down the development of AI such that we just don't make this deadline. So we face a deadline here of technological development. I said, say, roughly 70 years worth more of the sort of rates of progress we've seen in the past. If we don't get it by then, it may be many centuries later until you have another chance. And so many of the people concerned about AI's freedoms are also trying to restrict the rate at which AI improves in order to deal with their concerns, and that could make us miss the deadline.
Indeed, that is a conundrum that we face. Now, Elaine Walker writes that she does believe culture is the correct thing to focus on, and it is even correct to focus on it in the context of the culture surrounding AI and AI rights and what innovations we permit. She writes, since religion has dropped off as the so-called glue of society, we need a new glue, a dynamic optimism, a focus on well-being and curiosity about the world and the universe. She says she can only speak for the USA, but really these are the values of transhumanism as well, though there is, let's say, a coalition of associated philosophies that could embrace those values. So do you think that could be an effective cultural fix, not going back or necessarily fixing things the way they are, but adopting a set of meaningful values that will inspire people and will lead them to create a more dynamic and innovative economy, whatever happens to fertility rates, especially if we ourselves are able to extend our lifespans and our productive lives as well?
So again, the most conversations about these sorts of things are from the point of view of someone embedded in a particular culture, wanting it to move in a certain direction. And that's the kind of move being made here, basically saying, gee, wouldn't it be better to be dynamic optimists in our direction of culture? And then what you're typically doing is recruiting cultural resources from the recent past of that culture to say, this is more true to who we are and who we want to be than the other visions. That's how most cultural debates go. And the thing that's missing is a description of how that's going to be adaptive. The problem is cultural evolution was just ruthlessly killing off cultures and they weren't adaptive. That's how we got to where we are. And now in the last few centuries, we just decide to change cultures for these internal cultural reasons, but it doesn't seem to be making them adaptive. They're just changing. So, I would want to know, well, why is dynamic optimism adaptive? How does that make us deal better with other sorts of problems that culture is supposed to help us deal with? Now, remember, we're doing fine at rates of innovation of the things we're allowed to vary within our culture. The problems we have is with innovation of things that aren't allowed to vary within a culture, the things that we like, say, organ sales or something. If nobody's allowed to do organ sales, then we never find out if it's better because nobody's allowed to try. So then you need a dynamic optimism that induces more experimentation with things that violate people's key values, i.e. you need to induce people to be more tolerant of variation in practice based on different fundamental values. And as I said, that's the kind of variety people hate the most.
Well, there could be, let's say, experimental jurisdictions, whether in seasteads or microstates, where there could be a widespread agreement that these are like sandboxes of innovation and the great powers will leave them alone.
But we'll need a cultural change to allow that. People at the moment don't like the idea of sandboxes and variation. They want to crush any variation anywhere. So that's a key question, is how can we induce that culture change? I do have one last class of fixes to describe. And this class is where we integrate governance more into the solution. So in history, of course, culture and governance have often worked together in the sense that culture has encouraged governance changes and governance changes encourage the cultural changes, and that often using the power of government has helped move culture, like think of civil rights laws, things like that. It's a dangerous power to try to wield, but it might be tempting here. So I'm the inventor of a form of government I call futarchy that's based on betting markets. The slogan is vote on values, but bet on beliefs. And the idea is that we could pick a goal, and this form of government is very good at achieving whatever goal you specify. It's quite reliable, it's quite expert and effective at achieving goals. Now, for ordinary government, then we'd have to, vote on what goals we all wanted, some weights of, leisure and prosperity and peace and those sorts of things. And, we might argue of how much to get which higher weights, but the promise here is that if we in fact want the things we say we want in these goals, the government would in fact effectively achieve it. And that would be a way that we could rely on this form of government to actually do things more than can rely on current governments. Currently, if you elect some politician who plans to do X, he says when he's elected, that doesn't mean he's going to do X. Doesn't mean he's even going to try very hard. We just don't have very good ways to make sure they do what they promise. But this form of government could do that. But now this isn't a solution yet. It's the piece of a solution. So here's the key idea. Imagine we pick a goal that is a long-term goal that's inconsistent with civilization collapse. And we pick this as our sacred goal, and we have a form of government that says we really want this to happen. And so I did some surveys of what could function as a goal for here. And in fact, three of the top four were space. The goal could be the date we get to the stars, or the date 1 million people are living in space, or something like that. And we create a futarchy form of government with this goal given high weight. Yes, we want to survive at the moment and not be miserable, et cetera. But we also want to achieve this long-term sacred goal of, say, getting into the stars or getting into space. And we put a high weight on that, and it happens to be a goal that's inconsistent with civilization collapsing. So when we, implement this, the key point is that as soon as speculators see that this is our goal and we're going to stick with it, then they will look for policies that achieve this goal. They will notice, civilization collapse will get in the way. I guess we need to stop that. And they will start to implement policies that prevent civilization collapse. And those policies will get in the way of some of our treasured cultural trends. And then if it wasn't a sacred goal, if it was just, hey, something we were trying, we would go, well, hell with that, and change the goal again until it was something we were comfortable with, because we don't want to make these changes. But see, this is the trick. If it's a sacred goal, then often we're proud to make sacrifices for a sacred goal. That shows our devotion to it, proves us that we really do care about it. So if we could pick a long-term goal inconsistent with collapse and have that as our society's sacred goal, that we were devoted to it and proud to sacrifice for it, then it would make sure that we don't collapse population, et cetera. And then when we noticed policies being imposed on us that, interfered with some of our treasured cultural trends, like longer years of school, we would go, oh, well, apparently that's what it takes to achieve our sacred goal. And we would say, let's do it. So now this is an attractive vision, but look at how much I'm asking. I'm asking a lot here. First of all, I'm asking that my form of government gets tested out enough and it's proven to work, and then we're willing to adopt it. Secondly, we have to agree on this long-term sacred goal and be willing to devote to it. And our society isn't actually very much in the mood to devote itself to any sacred goals really lately. Maybe anti-racism is the latest version, but only relatively mild sacrifices made in its name. But this is a way, at least, that maybe a big chunk of the mainstream world civilization could then not collapse, and then the future would inherit things we value. So that's, to me, the main reason I don't like the Amish Heredum taking over scenario is they will throw away many things that we have worked hard to create and value. And yes, eventually probably rediscover most everything that's worth rediscovering a long time down the line. But I'd rather it not were such a long time down the line. I'd rather that we found a way to save our civilization from collapse. AI and M's is one way to do it. This is another way. But I think you can see that none of the solutions I've offered are terribly reassuring, very reliable. Like they're all long shots, right?
Well, this is quite fascinating. As you were describing the combination of futarchy with a sacred goal in our chat, we had Alan Crowley and John H. produce the quotation from John F. Kennedy, "We go to the moon not because it's easy, but because it's hard." And that did inspire a lot of people in the 1960s. And if we think about the current prevailing demographic of transhumanists, they came of age during that era or a little bit later when there were still residual effects of that, when you had kids wanting to be astronauts when they grew up. And interestingly enough, the era where John F. Kennedy provided that inspiration, it coincided with the tail end of the baby boom as well. So there is evidence for the sacred goal motivating civilizational progress. I think a lot of us in the transhumanist community look back somewhat wistfully at that time period, thinking what might have been had that degree of techno-optimism continued into the present day. But I wonder, could radical life extension be a similar sacred goal? We could have space as a sacred goal, but also combine that with radical life extension for individuals, which could be made similarly inspiring if we develop the correct messaging for it and we're able to achieve the level of reach that John F. Kennedy achieved with the space message.
So that was the other of the top four, immortality. Many people in my polls, I think I had 16 or so different possibilities, and these were at the top. So many people do think immortality could be the sort of goal that can inspire people to sacrifice as a future thing. And of course, you have to believe that we aren't going to invent it real soon, because otherwise it won't prevent civilization collapse. It would be the sort of thing we'd need several centuries of sustained effort to achieve. But that does seem plausibly true to me. Now, it's worth noting that, in fact, the median US citizen did not like the space program. And so we did not, in fact, go into space just because we had a sacred goal. We did it to impress the world of our ability compared to the Soviets, and we succeeded in that, and that's why we did it. And so, unfortunately, we don't have an alien race to do that against now, but maybe we could actually make it the sacred goal that we claimed it was before.
It's interesting because I was wondering if having a common enemy to unite against would help in this regard. But of course, we want to make the common enemy something truly terrible. So we don't want it to be other people or other nation states. We would want it to be, say, something like COVID. But of course, that didn't work, because after the overreaction of the initial lockdowns, the cultural adaptation to COVID seems to be to ignore it, accept that it will happen to you multiple times, and hope that it will be mild. So that didn't work as the common enemy. I'm hoping that death and decay could be that common enemy, but perhaps for some people it's too abstract. Daniel Tweed writes, also, it's hard to inspire people with an indefinite goal such as indefinite longevity. Perhaps we could have more specific markers, like have average life expectancy reach 90 by 2030, or have maximum lifespan exceed 135 by 2040. What do you think of
the annual mortality rate would be the obvious metric to use.
Mhm.
And you could do it for different ages, but you say, the fraction of people 60 or older who die each year, push that number down, then that would be a pretty clear marker of that. I have some work on grabby aliens, or where aliens are in the universe, and the implication of that is they are actually out there roughly once per million galaxies. We might meet them in a billion years. So you could perhaps motivate people with wanting to sort of meet them from a position of strength in a billion years, but that's a really long delay to motivate people with. Unfortunately, they probably aren't closer than that. But that's one way to frame the space ambition, is not just we want to get out there, but we want to get out there as soon as we can before the aliens and be as strong as we can before we get to that position.
Yes, indeed. Now, I wanted to also enable Art Ramon to ask a question, and then we have various other topics and questions to consider, including the Great Filter. But Art Ramon, please go ahead.
Kind of along the aliens idea. I've had this hypothetical floating around in my head for like 2 years now. And it's sort of like 12,000 years ago, let's say you had some Neanderthals and they didn't become extinct. Instead, they became sort of a breakaway civilization. They had technology. You also had another group of people who were sort of hybrids of Neanderthals and humans. And they were sort of the Cro-Magnon people. And there were sort of variations of them. Either they had like over 50% Neanderthal genes or greater than 5% Neanderthal genes. And they also became, breakaway civilizations and decided to hide on this planet in Antarctica, underwater bases, wherever, on the moon. And since they've had such a leap ahead of us, they've developed advanced technology. They've sort of, self-directed their evolution. They've hyper-evolved into numerous subspecies, and now they see an opportunity. Humanity is on the decline, so maybe they say we're going to return to the surface of the planet and mingle with humans now, even though we're these superior beings compared to the regular humans with less than 5% Neanderthal. And I've had these thoughts sort of bouncing around, and no one seems to give me any attention on it. I've sort of put it out there, and maybe it's too crazy and radical, but disclosure seems to be happening. They seem to admit there is something out there that is not necessarily alien. They kind of hit maybe extra dimensional. But what if there were breakaway civilizations from our fellow Homo sapiens, Neanderthals, and these hybrids of the Cro-Magnon? So, any thoughts on that?
So, I did this work on grabby aliens a couple of years ago, which was basically a more precise numerical version of the Great Filter that we were going to get to. But then we published that in Astrophysical Journal. It's the top astrophysics journal. So I felt like I was an expert on aliens because I had sort of the best theory of where aliens are in space-time. And so lots of people talking about UFOs, and I thought, I guess I should look into that in the following sense. Like a standard Bayesian analysis says there's two parts of figuring out whether you believe something. One part is called the likelihood. That is, you ask given any one hypotheses, what sort of things would you expect to see if that were true? And then what do you see? And trying to ask if the evidence of what you see, leans you toward some things that would be the source of those observations. But then the other part is called the prior. For the various hypotheses you're considering, you're supposed to ask, well, how a priori likely is that? How sensible is that? And for many people, say for UFOs, their first reaction is, look, the whole family of hypotheses you are considering is so crazy unlikely that I don't really need to look at your evidence, because whatever evidence you have, surely the best explanation is some sort of mistake. Somebody was drunk, somebody was lying, said something, because this hypothesis is just crazy unlikely. That's the attitude of many people about these sorts of hypotheses. And that would be the proper attitude if, in fact, the prior were that low. But I thought, well, I'm in a position to actually figure out the prior here. And so I thought that's what I should do. I'm not an expert about the particular sightings or whatever and what you should believe on the basis, but I am an expert on the prior, so I should do that. So as a relevant example, think of a murder trial. If 1 in 1,000 people roughly die of murder, and for any one person who could have died of murder, there's maybe roughly 1,000 people nearby who could have done it. So any one accusation of murder is roughly a 1 in a million prior. But actual murder trials often give you evidence sufficient to overcome a 1 in a million prior to convince you that somebody did it. That's evidence can quite commonly overcome a 1 in a million prior. If it was a 1 in a quadrillion prior, yeah, maybe you should not even consider the possibility of murder because it's so crazy unlikely, right? So I tried to do an analysis of what was the best story I could come up with such that that would make sense of there being aliens around here who look roughly like our UFOs look. And my judgment was that the prior there was roughly 1 in 1,000 to 1 in 10,000. So that doesn't make me someone who says aliens are here, but it does make me someone who says the prior is high enough that you've got to look at the evidence. You can't just dismiss this on the basis of that's crazy, because it's not that crazy. And my work there was just to come up with the most plausible scenario and then, ding each scenario for its unlikeliness in order to have a scenario that could make some sense of aliens being here and then being what we see as UFOs. Now, the same sort of game you would play with an alternative story of, our ancestors from 20,000 years ago made an advanced civilization and now they're hiding somewhere. You have to play the same game of trying to work out the priors and then compare it to our evidence, right? And I haven't done as much work on that, but those do look hard to come up with. So with aliens, and so if aliens say as the source of USOs, one of the key things you have to explain is, well, why are they only here in these, fuzzy sightings and not everywhere else? Because, they could have come here a long time ago and took over everything, and everything we see near us could all be remade by them. And so you have to come up with a story. Well, why not? And the same sort of thing you'd have to do with the story of an ancient civilization. You really have to say, okay, well, why are they hiding? What are they hiding for? Why don't they come out? And if they're hiding, why would they reveal themselves through these, passive aggressive dances? So that's where I would need to go and analyzing with this issue. Before I go look at somebody's claimed sighting of an ancient, civilization, I need a story here. So it's not crazy that there could have been an advanced civilization in our past, because the farther back you go, the evidence just gets washed out. So, if you go back 100,000 years, say, any relatively small or localized civilization, you just might not see. Now, if it's like a global civilization and, they had moon bases, well, now you have to wonder, well, why can't we see the old moon bases from 100,000 years ago? Turns out, we have timescales over where things just get obliterated by micrometeorites and stuff. And so the farther back you set it in the past, the more plausible it is you just have no evidence now. Except, well, if they're still standing around, they'd be creating evidence then, except they're hiding. Where are they hiding and why? I mean, that's the problem I have with that. But, I haven't looked into it, but that's what I'd be asking if I was going to look into it is I need to see a story here that makes some sense. So I think I could come up with a story for the aliens. Again, that gives you a prior that's high enough to be worth considering. I don't have a story like that for the Neanderthals.
Yes, indeed. Yes, thank you for that answer. And I do support disclosure of the information that is currently classified about these phenomena, because I think it could shed a lot of light on what actually did or did not happen to bring them about. But I also don't want to personally jump to any conclusions as to whether we've made any sort of extraterrestrial contact, because, as you mentioned, the evidence is kind of fuzzy and it's confined to certain kinds of observations. So I would say the jury is still out as to whether or not there has been any sort of contact with extraterrestrials. what I would say the most plausible story in my mind, if there have been extraterrestrial visitors, is that they follow some variant of the Star Trek Prime Directive with respect to us, and they consider us insufficiently advanced to actually fully be able to process the reality of other civilizations existing, and we wouldn't be particularly humane to them if we did know. So they're kind of waiting for us to reach some threshold of development. That is, if there are these other advanced extraterrestrial civilizations. Now, I think this is a good bridge to the Great Filter idea, because let's compare the scenario where we haven't made contact with any extraterrestrial beings to a scenario where there has been contact of that sort. Which of these would be a more optimistic scenario with regard to any sort of great filter, or whether a great filter exists? That is to say, if we haven't made contact with any such beings, are we more likely to be pre-great filter or post-great filter as compared to if we have? Or if we have made contact with such beings, could that be evidence that there isn't a great filter?
So my grabby aliens work is looking at the kind of aliens that appear at some point in space-time and then just keep growing and don't stop till they meet other aliens. Now, that's not all kinds of aliens. Some could just appear, last for a little while, and go away, but they're not the grabby kind. So our data constrains where those grabby kinds are in space-time, and as I said, they're a really long way away, and it's going to take a long time to meet them, most likely. Now, we aren't yet grabby. We aren't making a visible impact in the universe that you can see from a long way, but it looks like it could happen soon, but we're not so sure what the odds are from this point on. And honestly, I don't think the fact that we don't see much is much of an indication. Now, it is true that the lower the chances that we will become grabby, then the closer is the nearest other non-grabby civilization. So say there's only 1 in 1,000 chance that we're going to make it to become grabby. And then the grabby civilizations are once per million galaxies. Well, now the non-grabby ones are once per 1,000 galaxies. Okay. So the nearest one is closer, but still a really long way away. And so going to be crazy hard to see. So honestly, the fact that we don't see them says hardly anything about those chances, but there is that dependency. The lower our chances of becoming grabby, the closer could be the nearest non-grabby, but most likely you'd see the ruins of them and not them being active, because their life would be short or something like that. There is, though, if in fact UFOs, some of them are aliens, that actually changes our future prospects enormously. So again, I tried to work out the most likely story for what the hell they're doing, why they're here and why they're doing stuff, in order to make this prior analysis that I talked about. And here's my best story. First of all, they are panspermia siblings to us. That is, life didn't start on Earth. Earth was seeded with the stellar nursery where Earth was seeded with life from elsewhere. So maybe some other planet had life for 4 billion years before, reached up to the very primitive level we see at the beginning of life on Earth. It seeded our stellar nursery. Then we evolved for another 4 billion years. But that seeding of the stellar nursery also seeded 10,000 other stars who are all crammed close together with rocks flying around. So there are 10,000 other stars in our galaxy who were seeded with life also 4 billion years ago. And they're in a ring around the galaxy. And one of those reached an advanced level before us. And that explains why they're not a million galaxies away. They're here, but there isn't anything for a long way. The correlation between them and us is explaining by having a common origin. Now we need to explain why, if they got here before us, why the whole galaxy around us isn't colonized and reshaped, why they haven't been here a long time. So I think then we have to postulate a somewhat unlikely but not crazy idea that they have a rule against colonizing the universe. Could be religious, could be a cultural homogeneity thing. They like being all together, and if they allow themselves to expand, they will become fragmented and not forever at odds. But for whatever reason, they had a rule against any colonization of the universe from their home world. And that rule right there gives them a reason to be here. Because if they just let any of these other 10,000 star systems evolve, one of them could get to their level and expand and break the rule. So now they need to be watching these other stars and tracking them, and then coming and being ready to do something about us maybe breaking the rule. And if that's why they're here, it can also explain what they're doing, because the puzzling thing of what they're doing is, if they, plausibly, they would be maybe at least 100 million years more advanced than us. Okay. So with that level of ability, they could be here and be completely invisible. They could watch us with absolutely no chance of us detecting them. That would be completely within their ability. Another thing that would be completely in their ability is to be completely obvious. They could have definitely made themselves very visible and known. And then the strange thing is they did neither of those things. And they hang out at the edge of our visibility, doing nothing much, but just saying, hi, bye. That's weird, right? So we need an explanation for why, if they came all this distance, thousands of light years, millions of years ahead, here to talk to us when we finally reach this level, why are they doing that? And my theory is, well, they could have enforced the rule by killing us a long time ago. So the fact that we're here says, nope, they didn't want to kill us, which suggests they'd rather persuade us to follow the rule than force us. Okay. How are they going to persuade us? Well, they're going to domesticate us. Basically, social animals everywhere, including here on Earth, domesticate other animals. How do we do that? You just slip into the top of their status hierarchy. We domesticate dogs by being the top dog, top horses by being the top horse. How do you domesticate an animal? You show yourself the top one. What is the top one? Well, your higher status in their status hierarchy. Whatever counts for good, you're the best. And you're also not too hostile. That's how you slip into the top of a status hierarchy and domesticate species. So that's how humans domesticated each other. That's how emperors domesticated their empires, right? That's how it's always been. So the postulate is that's how it is in the universe. So if their simple strategy to get us to go along with their rule is to domesticate us by just hanging out, being very impressive and not being very hostile, and we're smart enough to figure out why they're here and what their agenda is as soon as we're convinced they're really there, and then we'll hopefully go along with their rules. And if we don't, they have a button somewhere and they have another solution, but they'd rather just persuade us. So that's my simple story about what they're here and why. And that has a big implications for our future. It means our future is much more limited than you might have hoped. They really are more powerful than us, and we're not going to be able to trick them or slip out of them or defy them. They're really going to set the terms, and we're going to have to do what they say. And that's just a much more limited future than you might have hoped. But hey, on the other hand, we'll eventually maybe get to meet this alien species and learn all that they've learned and figure out why they have this rule against expansion.
Yes. Well, this is an interesting possibility to consider. I will note Daniel Tweed in our chat provided the definition of grabby aliens, which are civilizations that first expand from their origin planet at a fraction of the speed of light, second, make significant and visible changes wherever they go, and third, last a very long time. So from the standpoint of transhumanist philosophy, we should actually want to be these kinds of grabby aliens, with the caveat that we would respect other forms of life if we encounter them. We wouldn't exterminate them. We wouldn't subjugate them. We would try to form some sort of coalition with them and have them share in our worldview, our desire to expand throughout the universe. So it would be essentially a cosmopolity of species aimed toward this kind of expansion. Now, Didier Kernel makes some interesting comments. He writes, it's very difficult for him to understand that people can think there are aliens coming here, one, who don't want us to see them, two, who are so advanced that they come here, but so poorly organized that we can sometimes notice their presence by accident. And he says he thinks you are saying that, but the theory of a small signal is not convincing to him. And my thought is, if the aliens wanted us to essentially be persuaded by their example, why don't they send like an enlightened alien avatar who would essentially sit in the sky
Right.
on a big throne and pronounce wisdom?
Let's consider that. Now, humans have tried to domesticate other humans on Earth, as invaders and conquerors, and they're often resistant to that because they highlight and focus on cultural differences as the reason why these invaders are not legitimate members of their civilization. So we humans have found ways to hate other humans pretty easily for relatively minor differences of our cultures on Earth. So if the aliens knew that that was a risk, then they would not want to reveal very much about themselves that we could hate, because they're not just other human cultures with, few thousand years divergent heritage. They're aliens, for God's sake. So they're actually going to be different in some big, huge ways. So that's a pretty big obstacle to their plan, right? They have to impress us as one of them, but somehow not show very much about themselves. Because, maybe they eat babies, and maybe that seems respectful for them, but we hate it, and they don't really know. Another key parameter here, see, they've got this rule against expansion. So if they're going to send out this expedition thousands of light years away, that expedition is itself a risk. If it goes rogue, their whole thing is over, right? So they don't want to give it very much discretion. So they have to pick a policy at home and send this thing out with only the resources necessary to implement this policy, and very restricted so that it doesn't go rogue and, break the whole rules. So they need a robust, simple strategy. They can approve it from home. And so the domestication one, it seems simple from home, but then there's this risk. Well, what if they hate stuff about us? So the simple strategy is don't show anything about you. Just show that you are powerful and capable and peaceful and pretty much nothing else. That's the way to minimize the risk that they'll hate something about you, is just don't say anything.
I would be quite curious to see or read a work of science fiction from the perspective of those kinds of aliens and how they deal with their, let's say, internal messaging approaches toward humans, and how that produces the observations that some humans have had of them. At the very least, it would be quite fascinating from a science fiction perspective.
Again, the UFO thing is a sideline because most likely it's not true, but still, it's interesting to consider. But the grabby aliens is much more likely true. And I think it's interestingly sets a different framing for our long-term future. So, traditionally, the usual physics framing is the universe has always been dead and empty, and we're the only life, and then we're the only thing that will ever happen. If we die, there will be nothing. And then if we go on, we will just go on and meet our own cousins, second cousins, but that's all there is. The grabby aliens thing says, no, in fact, there really are aliens out there, and we will, in fact, meet them if we last that long. And now our distant future has sort of a different vision to it. So the idea is now, well, look, when the grabby aliens meet each other, all these different civilizations, they will look at the others and wonder what the others have that's worth copying. They won't each just want to stay exactly the same. Now, they'll initially be very worried that somehow the others will have some technology they won't, because then they will be conquered or something. So they'll all be very eager to make sure they have maximum technology before they meet, but that's probably feasible. If we're talking a billion years, there's probably just max technology runs out in a million years. And then from then on, you just have all the max technology. So if they all meet at max technology, then probably they can't conquer each other. But what they can do is talk to each other and learn about each other. And then they could decide, well, what are those other, thousands of other alien civilizations that are vast and bigger? What have they learned that we don't know? What about their choices is worth learning from? Now, it might be that within our billion year civilization, we will have tried everything out there, and there isn't possibly anything we could learn from them, maybe, but there's a chance that there are things we could learn from them. And then we could aspire to sort of having something the others respect and copy. We could aspire to be respected. That's basically a status game of the alien civilization prestige hierarchy, and we would want to earn some respect.
Yes. Well, that would be one of the more positive futures that we could envision. I would like your thoughts on what is perhaps a much more negative and more alarming possible future because it's so proximate, and that is that the great filter is actually upon us right now, and it primarily manifests itself through the threat of nuclear war, which of course has escalated in recent years with the conflict in Ukraine, essentially between the only two powers that are capable of destroying the earth through nuclear weapons. So in 2022, I wrote this article suggesting that 2022 was the year in which the Great Filter was most acute. And if that is the case, then right now we may still be in a kind of Great Filter, but the probability of the catastrophic decline of the human species, at the very least, us falling into a new dark age, is lower than it used to be. But I do wonder what you think of the hypothesis that if there is a great filter, it actually consists of civilizations attaining nuclear weapons or analogous weapons of mass destruction without yet attaining the kind of enlightened governance that would actually prevent nuclear weapons from being used. And we may be in the most pivotal years of our civilization where we absolutely need to prevent nuclear war. And if we do, we get to have this great open-ended future where we might potentially meet alien civilizations. But if we don't, that might be an indicator that essentially the great filter is what destroys all of these emergent civilizations through nuclear war as the mechanism.
So a long time ago, I had a paper on collapse, basically, and the risk and consequences of collapse. And I like the following metaphor. The reason to be careful of slipping on the stairs is not that you might go down one step and have to go back up one step. The risk is that by slipping one step, you might then cause yourself to slip a second step, and then even a third or fourth step in accelerating rate and probability, and fall all the way down the stairs and break your neck. That's the reason to be careful in the stairs. So similarly, it seems pretty clear that in fact a nuclear war can't kill all humans. That's just beyond the capability of nuclear war, such as we have it at the moment. Maybe a certain kind of pandemic could have a bigger chance of killing all humans, but even still, that looks unlikely. So as a one-step risk, the odds of extinction seem low, but we would certainly be far more vulnerable to more things going wrong after a nuclear war. So it's well worth preventing that, of course, not just to prevent extinction, but prevent all the harm that could result from it. So I very much want to prevent war. I would have to admit that after a nuclear war, probably we would get cultural drift set aside. That is, we'd probably have pretty substantial selection pressures then in the communities trying to revive from a nuclear war. So for a while, at least, cultural drift would be fixed, but this is not a solution I wish on people. If I look at the longer term future and ask what's the most likely great filter that we could face between now and actually persistently spreading out in the universe, I don't actually think it's nuclear war leading to a further collapse to extinction. I think the biggest risk is the one I described in this alien scenario, that our descendants have a world culture and world government sufficient to decide they don't want to expand, and they enforce that rule. And then we don't. To make that clear, so we enjoy at the moment being part of this world culture where we all kind of agree on lots of stuff, and that limits our conflict. So we love the fact that we don't have different fundamental values around the world. We love the fact that we don't have as much war, and we don't have as much conflict, and we trade and travel, etc. We love the fact that we share a world culture, and we agree with each other, and we are part of a world community that shares a lot of culture. This is a thing we like. And we have to know eventually that whenever colonists leave from the solar system to go off to other star systems, that's the end of that forever. The colonists would, in fact, go out and have competition and selection and change, and eventually come back and vie for control over the center. And our being a single civilization with shared values and fast communication ends when anybody leaves the solar system. And you might imagine people so valuing being a unified culture and people. And so it's not on Earth. That is, even in the solar system, if somebody defies the central solar system government, it's pretty easy to send a rocket and smash them anywhere in the solar system. You're not too far away to be disciplined by a center government in the solar system. If you're in another star system, you are too far away.
Yes, this was quite interesting, and actually it dovetails with Daniel Tweed's comment. His sacred goal is a spacefaring species future, and one consequence of that would be to restore essentially a greater dynamism in cultural evolution and this cultural heterogeneity of the widespread colonist cultures that won't all be part of the same monoculture. Now, we have 3 minutes left in our salon time today. So along the lines of culture, I would like to hear your thoughts on this comment by Corshey, who writes, "A culture that can explain how it is good for human life on the individual level will prevail in the long term." Do you think that view, which is quite an optimistic view, that ultimately the culture that convinces more people to follow it because it is actually good for them is the one that will prevail? Do you think that view is plausible?
If you look at animals on the earth, they live lives that are adaptive. They are lives that are fit to their niche, and their behavior fits in the niche in order to make them survive and thrive and not go extinct, at least sooner. And do the typical niches of animals make the animals happy? Do they make them thrive? Well, in a sense, they do, because their concept of thriving is evolved to match their niche. If you think about, which is it easier for evolution to change, your world or your attitudes toward your world? It looks like your attitudes toward your world are actually more flexible, more fluid, more available to be moved and changed. So, for example, humans loved being foragers, and then farming was actually kind of alien to the forager world. Farming was more unequal. There was more conflict, more, less variety of food, and slavery and war and all sorts of things. But farmers inherited a culture that told them their way of life was better than the foragers, and they believed it. And so, the key question is there a true nature to what it is to thrive that's different from what we've inherited from DNA and culture that was once matched to our previous environments? If there's this true nature of thriving, then the question is, will future environments be such as to make us thrive by that, pre-existing definition of thrive? But if the definition of thrive can be changed, it seems pretty clear that a world where natural selection continues will just make each world of creatures like the world they're in and like to do the things that make them adaptive in that world. That's our best explanation for why we like what we like, right? Why is it that you like the things that you call thriving? The reason we believe you like them is that they were once adaptive for your ancestors. That's why. There isn't another reason. There's no other source in the universe of what it is to be good or happy. That's the key hard part of culture. It's answering all these questions for you, and it's doing them randomly. The stark, scary fact is the deepest questions you have about life and value are answered by your culture, and the way it chose those answers was actually pretty random.
I just hope that we can contribute to some significant extent to the evolution of our culture in directions that actually provide us with objective well-being, like greater longevity or greater prosperity or colonizing other worlds. But thank you very much, Professor Hanson, for joining us today.
Thank you all.
Unfortunately, we are out of time, but this was just an extremely fascinating discussion, and many of our viewers will be revisiting the recording of it as well, I am sure. And let us try to achieve the more beneficial of the possible futures that we discussed. And I hope in those futures we can all live long and prosper.
Happy.